I start by getting you to talk about your research into the Manosphere and what that has encompassed, please?
Absolutely. So my research in the Manosphere actually started really within thinking about it through the lens of sport and how sport plays a role in the Manosphere. And what I became increasingly more interested in was the connections between sport and far-right politics. And really indirect connections, I should clarify. But how we saw increasingly over the last decade, far-right leaders like obviously Donald Trump in the United States, but also individuals like Modi, Bolsonaro, align themselves with sports and sports communities, particular sports as well, in order to try and bolster their authenticity claims to largely male audiences, largely working class male audiences. So that's really where I began to explore this area.
So, is to your mind, and and through the research that you've done, do you think that is why a lot of the influencers in this Manosphere space tend to associate themselves with sports a lot? Like the example that I've given to everyone that I've chatted to is that Andrew Tate is very vocal about the fact that he used to be a champion kickboxer, for example.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I would like to maybe take a step back and say that this isn't a new concept, right?
Mm.
If you look at, for instance, the history in the UK, for instance, of the National Front, if you can go right back to the 1970s and 80s, where they were associating themselves very explicitly with football in order to try and do the same recruitment strategies that we see today. In terms of the big Manosphere influencers, so for instance, Tate or Rogan, both of them have a background in sport that they want to accentuate. And that's largely because they're using sport as a way to signal their inherent masculinity. Right. I think that it also is a way to signal a particular class perspective. It's sort of understood to be more working class or working class towards middle class, and there's an authenticity there as well that they are trying to signal. The relationship, if I can, between sports masculinity and class, I think, is something that has been explored by sports sociologists, but it's something that still needs a fair bit more exploration, particularly the way that we see influencers use it today.
Sure. So, in your mind, then, like, what role does sports media have to play in this space? Then, should sports media be addressing what is said in the Manosphere? Should the honor personalities be engaging with that content?
Well, that's a difficult question. And that's a difficult question because we have to ask ourselves what we mean by sports media first. I'll give you a very simple example. When we say should, are we talking about should in terms of some sort of policy structure at either a corporate policy structure or a legal policy structure? And the answer for the legal side, anyways, would be it depends on what country you're in. If we're talking about BBC Sport, well, okay, the charter could indirectly address that, right?
Mm.
But if you're in the United States, ESPN can just use the First Amendment over and over and over to make claims that they don't have to. So there's an interesting legal space there. In terms of the more sort of ethical question, that's a difficult question as well, and for a series of different reasons, I think. One is I was made reference to the fact that often the connections are indirect, right? They're not explicit, and so can you blame some sports broadcasters or sports media more generally for having some of their on-air talent or even some of their coverage um, remixed and rearticulated by manosphere influencers? That becomes a bit of a slippery slope, right? Now, at the same time, you've got people, for instance, like the Pat McAfee show that you'd mentioned to me off air, that are openly endorsing and welcoming and embracing this content. That is an interesting question for a company, particularly a family values company like Disney, right? That they are allowing that. So I do think that there should be some sort of internal discussion. But can I complicate it a little bit further? Um, One of the arguments that my colleagues and I who work in this space are trying to make, that is sometimes at odds with many other folks that are researching this space, is that the manosphere is not a homogenous space. It's actually, I joke it should be the Manosphere, which is a terrible joke, but it does actually capture something important, which is that there's a diversity of viewpoints in that space. And in fact, the Manosphere is largely internet discussion, right? And so in that space, if it's a discursive space, you have to ask yourself, well, what is the reason that this has cropped up? And one of the reasons it's cropped up, as ugly as it can be, and it is extraordinarily ugly. I will not apologize for any of the sexist or racist material that show up regularly. There are conversations that have not been part of the mainstream discourse for quite a while, right? And
Such
many of the
as.
men around the nature of masculinity, right? The relationship between masculinity and suicidality and deaths of despair more generally. A number of those issues that I think actually that are largely, you and I off air had mentioned, to talk about the crisis of masculinity, that confluence of topics around the crisis of masculinity that do not get the coverage, at least in American media, that you would expect, right? Or if they do, it's sometimes more of a moral panic coverage, and because what we're responding to is arguably some of the worst content to come out of that space, right? And so we have to ask ourselves, okay, for every Andrew Tate that is out there saying absolutely absurd, dangerous things, how many other conversations are happening in that space that maybe do not reach that level, or importantly, and this is what some of our research has uncovered, are actively taking on Andrew Tate in that space, right? And so it's one of the reasons we study this area is because we are interested in looking at that discourse and saying, okay, it is overwhelmingly problematic, but what is it a response to, right? And I would argue it's a response to late capitalism, and men not finding purpose. You've got men not going to college and what have you, right? And so you've got this large under or unemployed group of individuals whose very identity, by interestingly, through the media, is still being accentuated in terms of old 20th century constructions of masculinity. At the same time, they're being told that those are problematic. And they're caught in this strange bind, right? Between sort of the siren call of the Andrew Tates of the world, who are saying, embrace this chauvinistic, disgusting construction of masculinity, in response to the fact that you find yourself in an identity crisis and in an economic crisis that's tied into that. And that there isn't a clear articulation by many mainstream political leaders or even by parts of Hollywood, because they don't want to speak to that, because they're worried about being tainted by the ugliness of the more sort of right-wing extremism that I think strategically identified that population as a target population first, and then has molded the way, at least molded the norms of that discussion space. But I actually see those men largely in crisis, and the only people speaking to them are actually those right wingers, at least speaking to them consistently. I
Sure.
would say
Okay.
that yeah, sorry, I'm going on for quite a bit, but I do think
No,
that
you're
there's an
the
interesting
expert. I
thing
want to
there.
hear what you say.
Yeah. Yeah, and when we speak about them quite a bit, and the piece that I'm assuming that you came across to when you found when you reached out to me, in the conclusion we actually explore, so like this late capitalist identity crisis is not being spoken about or interrogated by mainstream academia, by mainstream expertise culture, outside of a few random scholars like Richard Russo or what have you, right? And so they were just ripe for exploitation. And I think that's a large part of the story.
Sure. And I mean, one thing I would say from looking at this space more deeply is the people that get the most attention are the ones that are expressing the most extreme views. And
Absolutely.
one thing that you've mentioned in the articles of yours that I've read, one thing that you said in this chat is that the manosphere is not homogenous. It's not a monolith. There is a range of people and a range of views in there. So from what you've seen, do you think there are positive aspects to the manosphere?
Yes, I think there's a positive aspect to, and it's a very, a very qualified yes. Actually, let me clarify.
Sure.
Um, I am not going to again. I'm not going to be an apologist for the manosphere, but I am going to be someone that says we need to take it more seriously and speak to it as opposed to speaking about it. And so let me speak to what the potential positives are. There needs to be a space for men to try and figure out who the hell they are, right? There needs to be a conversation space where some of the issues that men are speaking about in terms of these conflicting messages, particularly conflicting media messages, and I'll connect this back to sport. Sport is still, despite I think many steps forward in terms of embracing a more diverse, and more progressive identity, depending on the sport. But overall, I think it has actually changed quite dramatically over the last 25 years in terms of its embrace of certainly different fans, women, LGBT, you name it, right? It still is playing into the concept of the male preserve, which is we are going to try and have basically various ubermensch go into battle with one another. And so that is still being put forward as the masculine ideal. At the same time that we have mainstream media telling men that's extraordinarily problematic because the argument is there's a short, very, very, very short pathway between being excellent at sport, let's say, or being excellent, in more of a traditional masculine space, and then suddenly becoming, a Me Too candidate, right? And so the idea is there's a pushback away from that. So you reject your traditional masculine identity, and I would agree. I think actually we should be rejecting very problematic aspects of traditional masculinity, but have we really articulated a clear version of what we could call sort of a new masculinity or a caring masculinity? There are different academic approaches to that, but they stay within the academy. I don't think that they filtered out in any clear way to the mainstream population, and I don't know if the mainstream population is interested, quite frankly. And so, if you're caught in that bind, right, where the rhetoric is at once telling you to embrace a type of masculinity that has also been villainized, then what do? Right? And that in that moment, that requires discussion. That requires, careful elaboration. And yes, often those discussions are infantile. The content is reprehensible. But every now and then, as our research has tried to sort of put a spotlight on, you can see elements of resistance. And so when I say the positive is there, the positive is to let the conversation happen and hope some of the logics that would be seen as healthier start to become louder. Are they at that level now? Absolutely not. But because the manosphere has positioned itself as a response to a censorious left, right? To try and shut it down or to say that there's nothing appropriate there actually adds more fuel to the fire and actually gives more power to those individuals, the right-wing influencers in particular, who are trying to take advantage of this identity crisis for their own wealth and or political power.
Sure. Okay. To that end, then, if we are wanting to find the positive aspects of this space, who are the people in this space that we should be listening to, in your opinion, then?
When we think about specific influencers, that's where I would have trouble. And that's where we can sort of take that political economic lens, hence the qualified yes. The loudest voices are the problematic voices. What I'm interested in terms of any large group space is to actually look at the everyday users and see how far are they willing to follow along and where do they say, no, that's a bridge too far. And so actually I would focus more on the individual users as opposed to specific influencers.
Okay, and I mean, the final question I would ask then is there anything that we haven't said in this conversation that you would like to raise and that you think is important when we are discussing the manosphere's relationship with sports?
I think that the role of athletes actually is something that I would focus on. And in fact, I think that this connects back to that idea of like who should we be looking towards. Um, I think that athletes actually do have an ethical, certainly not a legal responsibility. And one could argue that because of the logics of sport marketing, they may run into issues with potential sponsorship deals. Although you would think sponsorship deals would like what I'm about to say, but I actually think that prominent athletes should be speaking out. I actually think since they are being used aggressively in order to try and put forward some of these more alt-right, sports infused identity claims, then they should be pushing back. And a few of them certainly do, but I think it should be more common. And one of the easy arguments that we've seen in sort of the history of professional sport is, oh, these are athletes, these are not politicians. So these are actors, these are not politicians. But increasingly, what we're
Yeah, so
seeing
Laura
is
Ingraham telling LeBron James to shut up and dribble, for example, when he's an American,
exactly.
he has every right to express his opinion as much
Yeah.
as any other American, even if it was rather curse word laden.
Yes. Yeah, and LeBron James is a great example of someone who should be doing more, right? I think he's doing a good job, and I think actually, we should be seeing more of that. And Laura Ingraham is using that old logic of you're there to basically be my entertainment. You have no right to a fully fledged identity. But that's very problematic in today's sports media marketplace when so much of what athletes are making money off of is direct fan engagement through TikTok and Instagram and other social media, where they're actually providing a 365 view of themselves, right? So they're presenting themselves and selling themselves as individuals, not just as a basketball player or a soccer star, right? And so if you're going to start to embrace that idea of the 365 view, then that also means you need to bring the politics into this, despite what the Laura Ingrams of the world have to say, right? And I actually think that athletes have been really slow to embrace that. I understand why. I understand the larger industrial mechanisms within sports media that push back against that. But I do think that there's actually potential there. To say, okay, sure, Rogan was a champion, Andrew Tate, was a champion, but I was too, and I understand masculinity differently, right? That conversation would be powerful.
Sure. And I mean, one of the things that has come up as I've looked at this subject is there's this manosphere view of like what a real man is, and a part of what a real man is someone who is good at sport and successful at sport. But then, as a society, we have society telling us as men, you need to be this, you need to be that, and those two things can very much be at odds. Being the strong, successful, dominating sports person, but also being, kind and considerate and compassionate person. How in your mind can athletes marry those two, what can be considered separate identities? How do they marry those identities together then, in your view?
Well, that's an interesting question because I actually don't think they're quite the polar opposite as you suggested in the question. One can be competitive, but also be a good citizen, on the field or on the court. And we're actually, I think that's been a I suppose an issue over the last decade or so where we see poor sportsmanship, right? And people refusing to shake hands, calling each other out, verbally on the court, let's say, right? And so I actually think that the sort of traditional masculine virtue of strength doesn't need to be understood as dominance, right? I mean, this is where I think that those conversations in the manosphere have power, which is that a dumbed down version of strength is take everybody down, right? It is sort of a superhero version of the world. But there are other constructions of strength, that I think actually are very positive, right? To be there for your teammates, to be there for your family, to be there for your friends. That construction of strength is something that I actually think sports can model. So yes, I am, a very powerful individual, in my respective, sport. but look at what I do with the success that it has given me, right? Here's how I connect to charity work. Here's how I connect to if I'm doing that 365 Instagram live version of my life, here is how I show respect to everyone in my life, right? Whether it's teammates, family, individuals that are serving me at a restaurant. And so I think part of this is a rehabilitation of the old fashioned masculine virtues that have actually been sort of, I would argue, the late 20th century to the early 21st century were then understood largely as a negative. It's about trying to resuscitate those by looking at how they can be positive. And that I'm not alone. There's actually some very good scholarship on that out there, that I think is worth exploring, because if we don't take sort of a final thought, if we don't take the manosphere more seriously, it will continue to fester into this cancerous sore that it looks like right now. But if we can think about how it can be worked with and how we can engage the individuals that are in this space, then perhaps we can actually do something more powerful.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, I agree. I agree with you on that point. One final point then. We've talked about athletes doing this well, and you've mentioned that you think LeBron does this well in terms of his response in being a 365 person. Are there any other athletes that you think are doing this well, and that that we as a society should look to as a good example that others should follow?
I actually am a big fan of how Caitlin Clark has been handling her sort of stratospheric rise, and especially because she has met with so much adversity. For the most part, not always, but for the most part, she has been um, very very graceful in the way that she has handled herself. So I would look there. She, I think that that's the one I would go to right now.
Okay. All right. Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you very much for your time, Chris.
Thank you.
And as always, as I said before we started recording, thank you very much for agreeing to do this. It's been an absolute pleasure and a joy to be able to speak to you and to get your expertise on this subject.
No problem. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you.
The BCS podcast is written, produced, edited and hosted by me, Brett Walker. Thank you to Boris Anderoff and Pixabay for the use of the music and sound effects in this podcast.